Alex here from Black Sheep IT Consulting. So what are we looking at? We're looking at the action attachment business component. So we have a activity with an attachment. So here's Buzz Aldrin on the moon. And what is this all about? We want to explore in this video how to convert Buzz Aldrin's and anything else image to Base64. So Base64 is the famous binary to text encoding scheme that's all over the internet. It's really a backbone application of the internet, really, as it can convert anything text or binary to text, which then can be transported over the internet like an attachment to an email and then decoded at the end consumer back into the original file like a PDF or an image of Buzz Aldrin on the moon. So look it up if you have, it's the first time you hear about Base64. It's just a Google search and a Wikipedia article away of explaining what this actually is. But the fact is it's everywhere and it can be very useful. For example, let's put it to the use case we will discuss in the next few moments to convert any Siebel attachment to Base64 because you want to use it somehow. So let's start in Siebel Tools, and what I'm doing here is I create a new business object called BCRM Action Attachment, and that business object will have only one business component, that is action attachment. So I'm exposing action attachment, which is typically a child, as the primary business component for a new business object called BCRM Action Attachment. So very easy steps here, but this isolates the business component and I have a business object to wrap it. And now I create an integration object using the tools wizard. And that integration object, of course, I will base upon my new business object. And the primary is the only one here. And let's name it Base BCRM Action Attachment. Base and space is the naming convention to use it in the REST API, which of course will be very interesting later. So there's only one thing to expose. I'm clicking through the wizard and finishing the integration object. Let's inspect it real quick. So there should be one integration component, action attachment, should have a bunch of fields as per the business component. So yeah, some calculated fields are inactive, that's fine. I'm just fine with this as I need it only to query the attachment. And now let's go back to our example record and let's grab the row ID of that attachment record. Here it is. I'm saving it in the comments, maybe just for later. So I don't have to do all about record all the time. And that's my test record. So now I'm inspecting the workspace. And yeah, let's go to the business service simulator. And let's test our integration object and business object combination using EAI Siebel adapter query. So query takes the name of an integration object. That's output int object name. You can look it up in Siebel Tools. And that's the name of my new integration object, which I want to test now. And it takes, query also takes a primary row ID. So the row ID of a primary record. And that's my attachment row ID. So let's run this and we should yield a Siebel message child property set. Let's save it to a file real quick because that actually converts it to XML. And I can see that the attachment record is represented as Base64 already in an XML converted Siebel message. Okay, so that's very cool already. So armed with that knowledge that an XML converted Siebel message that has an attachment in it will contain the Base64, I went about and created a workflow process. And I will discuss this workflow process, and we'll see how we use the capability of the XML converter to create that Base64 string and then extract that very string so it's an actual output property of that workflow. So we have Base64 of an attachment as a service. That's BOFFAAS or something. Okay, so here's my workflow. Let's start with the process properties. You see I created a bunch of process properties and we will use them along the way. Some have defaults, which I have to override when I call it, etc. So the first step in the workflow is EAI Siebel Adapter Query, the same step I ran in the Business Service Simulator as a kickoff test. And it takes the integration object name that I can pass in as a property, so it works with any integration object. So let's say not just for action attachments, but also for service request attachments or account attachments. So this is the output integration object name, input argument for the query method, and I'm passing in the object ID of the workflow as primary row ID. So when the step runs, it produces a Siebel message, output argument, which is a hierarchy, a child property set, which I then assign to the Siebel message to process property. So apparently I messed around and I have a Siebel message to process property, which must be, well, it's type out, so it will be written to the output, and it's importantly the hierarchy data type, so an arbitrary property set hierarchy. So that's our Siebel message here. No Base64 in that one, by the way. The next step I labeled convert Siebel message to XML. So here I'm using the EAI XML converter with the unintelligible int object hierarchy to XML document method, but it does what it says on the tin. Integration object hierarchy, that is a Siebel message, to XML document. So I'm putting in my Siebel message as an input argument, and in the output argument from the value, the output property set value has the XML, and I'm assigning that to a process property called XML. And that process property, importantly, must be of the binary data type. So it's actually a stream. So a octet or binary stream, if you will. It's not a string. But that doesn't matter. It's used internally only here. And all the standard business services from Siebel can deal with it. So this XML already looks a little bit like we've seen in the simulator and contains the Base64. So now I want to extract that Base64, but it's embedded in an XML stream, which is hard to parse in, let's say, eScript or workflow. So here comes the trick. I convert that XML back, but this time not to a Siebel message, but to an arbitrary, just normal property set. So any element of the XML will be converted to a property set. How do you do that? You use the XML converter business service, and it has a method XML to prop set. So any XML can be converted to a property set. Very useful, by the way. So I'm taking in the XML that was formerly a Siebel message and now contains the Base64, and I'm passing in that property, the process property, to the value of the input property set. That's where it expects the XML stream. And the output is, well, my converted XML. Notice I did not specify any output argument because it actually has none. I'm taking all of it into the converted XML, which is a property set. So if we look at the process properties, converted XML is also of the hierarchy data type. Okay, so I have here a property set which contains a property which the value of which is a base64 string, and I'm interested very much in that property. So here I'm extracting the value, the base64 that I'm interested in. And that is the first and the only eScript business service that I wrote as a helper to help me extract that XML. So it has a method extract XML, and it's actually eScript. Now let's look at that eScript. Okay, so there's a simple pre-invoke method handler. It dispatches the method. Nothing to see here really. So here's my extract XML method. So this is very, very lightweight, very primitive code. It's just for purpose of demo. So what I'm doing here is I'm taking the second hierarchy, so taking the first child of the input, and then the second child. That should put me in kind of a root situation. So I should now have the attachment integration object instance, more or less. And I'm getting the type of that property set and passes out at the root type just for debugging. Then I get the child count of that root property set I have. Here's the B64 string, empty, and an iterator for a loop. So there's some comments here. There's the loop I'm doing. So I'm practically, for each child, getting the child and then checking the type. And if the type contains file buffer, then I'm exactly where I want to be. That file buffer property contains in its value the base64. So I'm grabbing that, getting that very child, get value. Here's my base64 string. Now it's a string. And then I set it as the output property base64, and that's it. Okay, so not much to see here. It's just a helper business service that helps me parse that property set and grab exactly what I want. Okay, so now the output argument, I'm just assigning the base64 doc output argument to base64 doc process property, so I can pass it as output of the workflow process. And don't mind the debug and helper message here, which of course are just for debugging. The workflow has a debug mode, input, debug flag, which is quite useful. It's default to no, but if it's set to yes deliberately, it writes out the Siebel message and it writes out the base64 to two separate files for, well, debugging and logging. So let's run that workflow. I have delivered it, and together with the business service and the integration object. So let's run the workflow process manager. Run process method. And the process name. So the workflow, of course, I need to specify the process name. Sorry for that, process name. That's my process name. And then I need the object ID. Here we go. So that's the row ID of a valid action attachment. And I need the integration object name, process property, and that's base CRM action attachment. And let's set that debug flag to yes, shall we? Okay, so that should be good enough. Let's run the workflow. Okay, it comes back nicely enough with the Base64 doc property in plain sight, and you can already see that's Base64. That's great. I cannot copy it from here because it's truncated, but I have the debug file. And here's the file path default. What else do we have? So you see the debug message. It jumped in on the action attachment property. And nothing else really to see here. So the thing I'm really after is that Base64. But while we are here, let's check out the children, because in the output, you can see the Siebel message, the original Siebel message, which is like your run-of-the-mill Siebel message. So it has that list of integration component. There's the action attachment, but since it contains attachments, it also has an attachment property set. And you can see that this is not Base64. So the original Siebel message has the binary stream more or less. You can see JFIF, that's JPEG reference. So you can still see the binary stream of the document. So that's the original Siebel message. It comes out of EAI Siebel adapter, but I also have the converted XML here. So after converting that Siebel message to an XML that represents that Siebel message and converting it back, I get this one. So the first child is the action attachment. And each field is now a child property set. So that's a little bit weird, but that's what my eScript handles. So I could read not just the Base64, I can read anything. So I go to that property, for example, activity file name, and read the value, and that's bus and .jpg. So I have the file name, I have the file size, I have the parent ID, if that's useful. And the file buffer in the action BC, it's the activity file buffer. So remember in the eScript, I'm just looking for a file buffer. So it's generic. And here's the Base64 that I'm grabbing with get value in the eScript. So it's buried in here, and I just grab it and unbury it and make it a process property. Okay, so that workflow process spits out. So you give it the name of an integration object, which represents an attachment, business component, and you give it a row ID of one attachment, and it produces the Base64 as a string. That's what we wanted. So the workflow was run in debug mode. So I have two files here. I have the XML, which is the Siebel message. And just to prove that it, after XML conversion, which the file writer does, it has the Base64 buried here deep in the XML itself. So that's embedded Base64 in XML. And I do have the Base64 proper. So that's the whole string. Okay, so let's see if that really worked. So let's copy that whole thing, a Base64 string, and let's use a Base64 decoder. You can find those on the web. I'm using base64decode.org, and there's a file. I can upload a file here. So let's upload that Base64 file, decoded, and it allows me to download the decoded file as a JPEG, all right, and it's Buzz Aldrin on the moon. So yes, the whole Base64 is sane and healthy. How cool is that? Okay, let's see if we can realize a Base64 of an attachment as a service use case. So as a service means really as a REST service, because with Siebel 23. And remember, I named the integration object like the business object, and I prepended it with base and space. Now, base and space before the business object name, that's the name of an integration object that can be used for the data API. So the data API in the REST API uses those base integration objects. So let's just query it for anything that starts with base, and you get the idea. So there are a bunch of standard base integration object, and I created some custom ones for DevPops, for example. So let's go to Postman and do a GET request. So here's my server, Siebel v1.0/data, and now the name of the business object without base and the name of the business component. There's only one, action attachment, and followed by maybe a row ID to query one individual record. So when I run this, I get the data, but as just the data, where's the Base64? And in higher versions of Siebel, CRM 21.12 or higher exactly, you can append, and it gives you the hint already, you can append fields equals activity, or let's say business component related, attachment ID. So if I append this to my query, still using GET. So now just give me the field activity attachment ID, and this does the magic. Oh yeah, hello Buzz. And Postman, well, it identifies this as a JPEG and it shows it immediately. The output is not Base64, the output is the actual image, so it's the stream, the download, if you will. So we want the Base64. And when working with attachments, you can use the inline attachments equals true input or query argument. Inline attachment equals true. So that instead of the field name, if we send this, it's still a GET request, and we get the JSON back. Let's say we can do a pretty print or something like that. That's pretty enough. We see the JSON has the activity attachment ID, and that's unmistakably the Base64 encoding of that famous image. Okay, so we have, thanks to the integration object that we designed with the name of base, very good in hindsight, we can immediately use it as a data API without any further customization or configuration. It just works. You need to have 21.12 or higher for the attachment stuff to work, but that's pretty rad already. So now we have that workflow. Can we run a workflow through REST API? Yes, in 22.3 and higher, you can run a workflow directly. So I already tried that out. You have to register the workflow in the business process access. So let me show you that. So you go to Administration, Application, Business Process Access, and very much like business services, you add the business process, that is the workflow process, to the list, and then you add one or more responsibilities. So the workflow process can now only be invoked by people who have that responsibility. That includes the REST user that we are using. So with that prepared and the cache is cleared, I can now call /workflow, name of the workflow, and an input body, it's a post request, a JSON body with the necessary input argument. So here's my object ID, the row ID of an action attachment, my integration object name, and the debug flag to true, just to be on the safe side. So this will invoke the workflow, and remember the workflow takes the input arguments, and let's look at the workflow again, in case we forgot. EI Siebel adapter, EI XML converter, XML converter, converting it back, the helper business service, and in case of debugging, the writing of the log files. So that should happen now through the REST API. And Let's see the results. Yeah, the results are in. This is definitely, we can see the Base64, it's the biggest chunk here, but it's the output of the workflow. So we have an error code, which is empty. We have the file path, we have the debug information, and there's the Base64 doc output property with, unmistakably, the Base64 string. So you have two ways. You can either call the integration object directly through the data API, or we can call any wrapper workflow through the workflow API, or we can create a wrapper business service and call it through the service API. So any external application can benefit from whatever we have inside Siebel and get a Base64 encoded string of a Siebel attachment as a service. And that's it. So I hope you enjoyed this little code along. Thanks much for watching. Take care and bye-bye.